The more advanced an ancient society has been, the more information is passed down to us as to how they lived, their exploits and their failures, and in general the kind of culture they had. For example, the Sumerians developed writing about 3,000 years before Christ, and they wrote about their victories in battle, their contracts for the sale of cattle, the purchases of land, the laws that they lived by. And yet there are other ancient peoples about which we know little or nothing. The Egyptians referenced trading with a people from a land called Punt. It was apparently a wealthy and prosperous land that conducted commerce with several nations in and around Africa, but to date no one has a clue as to who these people were or where their nation was. There are several places and peoples in Europe and the Americas and the Orient about which we're almost totally ignorant. So we're very blessed to have considerable information passed down to us about the cultures that existed in the lands where our faith was delivered to the world. The Jews gave us the Bible. The Greeks made reference to Israel some 300 years before Christ. The Egyptian Pharaoh that left us the Merneptah Stela about 1,200 years before Christ talked about his military campaign into Israel. And there are extensive writings by the Jews themselves about their culture and their traditions, and specifically about the temple. The Jewish historian Josephus is by far the best source of historical information that we have outside the Bible itself. He wrote about the temples. He wrote about Solomon's temple. He wrote about the Hasmoneans, and he wrote about Zerubbabel's reconstruction, and he wrote about Herod's temple. He's a great source of information for us. I find interesting his writings about the veil of the temple. Some reports, even Josephus's own writings from one period of time to another, show us that there were different situations concerning that veil. At one time, at least, he talked about veils being hung parallel. That is, when the priest went in, there was not just one veil, but there were two veils only a cubit apart. The first veil did not reach the wall, the outside wall of the temple, and he could enter in there and turn and go down this narrow passageway all the way across to the other side of the temple, and then he'd find another short space there where the veil didn't reach the wall, and he could enter that. And that would allow him access, if he was in the holy place, that would allow him access into the Holy of Holies. It's interesting. He describes other times when there was only a single veil in each location, but he said that they were woven works and as wide or as thick as a man's hand is wide. He tells us that there was a chamber in the temple called the Chamber of the Curtain, where these veils were constructed. That some 82 young female virgins were employed there, building these extra veils, because if one was damaged or if it was soiled and it needed to be replaced, then they had them on hand. There was also a meticulous system of cleansing that Josephus describes for the times when the veil was removed and then they planned on putting it back. They employed some 300 priests taking it down, putting a fresh one up right behind it so that the holy place or the Holy of Holies was not exposed. It was hung up right behind it. These 300 priests would take the other veil and they'd put it through a mikvah or a ritual bath, a cleansing process. It lay it out and let it dry until sundown, when again it was folded up and stored or hung back in the holy place, whatever the situation was at that moment. It's all very interesting, at least to me. The mother of Jesus, Mary, was said to have worked in that chamber of the veil when she was just a young child. But during the times when adjustments were made, such as the hanging of the double veil, and even at the time when Solomon's doors were removed and given as tribute to the king of Assyria, they were gold-plated, and that Hezekiah took them down, according to Josephus, and gave them to the king of Assyria so he wouldn't invade. Well, when there were changes made, there was great concern about the level of holiness in the chambers and in the temple itself. Would the dimensions being changed by the removal of the door or by the hanging of a double veil, would that change the level of holiness in the holy place, or in the Holy of Holies, or in both chambers? What about the passageway itself? Would it be on the same level of holiness as the first chamber or the second chamber, or would there be this third level of holiness created for it? Those types of discussions seem to occupy a lot of time and energy in those days. What we do know for a fact is that 3 of the gospel writers said that when Jesus was crucified, that veil was rent. And Matthew and Mark add this detail: it was rent from top to bottom. That means 2 things. That means that Jesus' crucifixion opened up access into the Holy of Holies for every person on earth. And secondly, it means that all of that concern for levels of holiness and the rituals of cleansing and all of the adjustments that were made, all of that stuff was in vain, because there was nothing in that Holy of Holies. It was an empty room. That Ark of the Covenant had disappeared 600 years before the birth of Christ. And when this temple was built, after the destruction of Solomon's temple by the Babylonians, 500 years, those priests had been going into an empty, dark chamber. What in the world were they doing in there? Just standing in there in the dark, in an empty chamber? But you know, the saddest thing of all is that many people today are satisfied with the same kind of experience. Their whole spiritual experience is nothing but an empty, dark chamber. May I suggest to you, you turn to Jesus. He opened up the way. He isn't satisfied with an empty, dark chamber. He died for your sins, and then he rose from the dead to give you access to a living God. Turn to Christ. That'd be the right direction.